My name is Jas Purewal. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself in a minute, but I'll talk about the more interesting stuff first, which is what we're going to talk about in eSports for about the next 20 minutes or so. I'm going to start off by giving you what I consider to be some fairly interesting numbers. I'm not going to try and talk too much about the basics of eSports and what it is, because I'm assuming if you're here, you have some interest, and there's been a lot of interesting discussion so far. So just a few numbers that I consider to be pretty interesting as an eSports lawyer and business advisor. And then we'll talk a little bit more about the meat of things, about who some of the key players are in eSports. I'm going to talk a little bit about players, about teams, leagues, events, and so forth, and try and give you a little bit of information about how the business deals are evolving and what the kind of terms of them, which you might normally see, are going to be. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the legal side as well, as I think that's probably the one thing so far that we haven't talked about very much. Not too much legal content, but we'll try and build it into the business wider implications as well. And then a few ideas about where eSports might be going, what some of the opportunities are, and above all, what the opportunities are for developers. And there's been a big theme today on this track about the opportunities for developers, and I'm going to sound a cautionary note, cautious optimism tempered by a certain amount of realism about what it's actually like to be trying to build an eSports game in 2016 and 2017. These slides are already available on SlideShare, so you're very welcome to grab them at any time. My contact details are at the end, so you can tweet me or ask me any questions any time. And I think the Casual Connect folks are going to put them online subsequently as well. Please feel free to ask me any questions at any time. If nothing else, it's half an hour of freebie advice from a lawyer, so ask anything you feel like. So a little bit about me. I'm a video games and eSports lawyer. I've been in practice for over a decade in the industry. My firm, Purewal & Partners, is based in London, but I practiced in Paris, elsewhere in mainland Europe, and in Silicon Valley as well. Our firm is focused entirely upon digital entertainment. Esports will be about a third of our practice this year. The remainder of it is video games and technology. I'm a big esports fan. I play Hearthstone tolerably well. I wouldn't really claim any great expertise in the other games because I'm so bad at them, but I try to get on the inside of esports as much as I can. In the esports world, we act for 3 of the world's top 10 clubs. We also act for 3 of the second-tier up-and-coming challenger clubs. I was international counsel for Twitch for a number of years, and also in previous times have advised most of the major publishers on video games and some esports matters as well. So in the last 5 years or so, we've liked to think that we've advised most of the different component parts of the esports ecosystem, although our present focus is primarily on clubs and on players as well. So a few numbers, as I said, I was going to talk about. No great science to any of this, no particular claim to knowledge. There are other people here who've talked much more authoritatively about knowledge. But these are the things where these kinds of 4 numbers, if I'm talking with people who don't know very much about esports, or if I just want to remind myself about what's happening, these are some of the numbers which I might mention, recent numbers too. So the first one is up here. Twitch said December just gone by that they'd streamed 500,000 years worth of content in just 2015 alone. Now, they didn't exactly break that down in terms of esports, but you could probably guess it was around 60 to 70% of that content was esports content. That's a lot of content going to a lot of eyeballs, and they're still relatively early in their esports broadcast journey as well. I found that interesting. Another one, and this comes from our friends at Newzoo, who's, if you want real information about esports data, I'd recommend what Newzoo are doing, as they're really the only folks who are really, truly trying to get good data here. And they made a number of estimations about where esports-specific revenue is going to go. Now, you have to treat that with a fair amount of caution. I don't mean that specifically with Newzoo, but just general in the industry. It's very hard to get really good statistics. Even in the video games industry, when we say the industry's worth 70 or 80 or 90 billion dollars, that's an approximation at best. One of the greatest British prime ministers was a guy called Benjamin Disraeli in the 19th century. One of his most famous quotes was that there are 3 types of lies: lies, damn lies, and statistics. So you have to be a little bit careful when you're looking at the size of the esports industry in terms of numbers, but it still gives you an idea of the overall size. My favourite game, as I mentioned earlier, is Hearthstone, and Activision Blizzard just announced they're up to about 40 million registered accounts. It's been estimated, but Blizzard haven't said, that monthly revenue is something like $20 to $30 million. That's very respectable, given that the original Hearthstone team was less than 10 people, and the whole thing was basically a bit of an afterthought. But as you may know, there are now a whole bunch of card games which are looking to emulate that success, and they're also looking to emulate the esports success that Hearthstone has had. And then the last number, and again, this is an estimate. Riot, and neither Riot nor Tencent have confirmed these numbers. Estimated that Riot's 2015 revenue from League of Legends was about $1.5 billion. Now, again, you need to bear in mind that the great majority of that comes from the fact that it's a free-to-play game. Riot is not making anything like that in relation to eSports revenue, but it's there, and that's going to grow in the future. And again, there's some estimations regarding CSGO or Dota, still extremely healthy numbers if they're even approximating the truth, especially bearing in mind that Valve, as I'm going to talk about, eSports has not traditionally been a focus for Valve. Valve has something in the region of 200, 250 employees, and only a fraction of those are focused even part-time or full-time in relation to eSports. So that's a hell of a lot of money to be made from a company that isn't really focusing upon this in the first place. As I said, some interesting numbers. I'm going to talk a little bit next about some of the key players in esports. Some of them you'll know, but I'm not so interested in the top line because everybody knows who they are. Although what I will say is, again, it's only really Riot that really has set out to really make an esports organization. The others are still kind of catching up. The more interesting one is the indies and the big publishers. So I think there's been a fair amount of talk regarding Super Evil, Megacorp and Vainglory. From an esports perspective, I think ever since Vainglory came out, people have talked about it as an experiment. And certainly the big clubs have not committed to the growth of Vainglories in esports. And that has changed in the course of the last few months. Super Evil, Megacorp have been very careful in not trying to raise expectations, in not doing huge, great big prize pools. They've done things in exactly the right way. And now you're beginning to see the clubs saying, okay, well now we think we'll start investing time here. And one of the themes I'm going to talk about repeatedly during this talk is that understanding what the clubs think and what the players think is absolutely essential if you want to build a successful esports game, because they will make or break it. It's not even so much about the consumer proposition, it's whether the teams and the players are going to be interested in putting talent into this. And we're getting to that now in relation to Vainglory. And then I mentioned Psyonix because Psyonix was the developer behind Rocket League. They're a really interesting example, as best I can tell from the outside, of an indie development company that has fallen into what's going to become esports success. Now, Rocket League wasn't the first game from Psyonix. Nosgoth, which was a battle arena game, was the first game which they came out with, in which they had aspirations regarding esports. And unfortunately, especially if there's anyone here who's from Psyonix or represents them in the room, my apologies, Nosgoth wasn't a success. And Rocket League, which is kind of a combination of racing and football, is now going to be really very successful, and they've kind of stumbled into it. And it's going to be really interesting to see where they go in that journey, and also, as I said, that critical inflection point where the clubs and the players say, actually, we want to put time into this, and we think we're going to make it into a real esport. And then I just mentioned in passing that in 2016 it's going to be a big year of experimentation for the big publishers. EA and Activision relatively recently have both begun to talk markedly much more than they had done previously about esports. Bobby Kotick has just gone on the record from Activision talking about how this is an NFL or a Premier League sized opportunity. I await to see with genuine interest and a little bit of caution about exactly where that's going to go. The big publishers have managed to succeed in moving into new aspects of the games industry, but it took companies like EA a great deal of money in order to establish a presence in mobile, and we'll have to see just how much money they're going to put up and how they're going to go ahead with building an esports presence. If what Activision and EA and Take-Two and Ubisoft and everybody else do is try to take an existing title and repurpose it for esports, I think the esports industry is a little bit more skeptical about that. So, for example, if EA puts all of its money into Battlefield as an esport, that's going to be a challenge. And again, I'm going to talk a little bit later about just a little bit about some of the design issues and difficulties of trying to retrofit a popular game into making it an esport game. They're not the same thing. So enough for now about key developers and publishers. The one thing actually I will say in passing before I go is developers and publishers are really interesting guardians of esports in a way that you don't have in traditional sports. As I was saying to someone in the audience earlier, one of the publishers was saying to me recently that in relation to their esport, they have a nuke button. If they don't like what's happening in relation to that esport, they have the legal ability to just stop what's going, to either come in and stop it or change it or do whatever they want. The only company that has its finger on the nuke button is Riot right now, because they completely control their system end to end, and to the extent they even have effectively a quasi-judicial system in which if they don't like what someone's doing, they have a set of rules and they'll apply them. No one else really does that. But the fact that you can do that in esports has not only legal implications, it has a whole variety of business implications. The best way, I guess, to think of it is how if you're making a mobile game or a mobile free-to-play game, to some extent you are subject to the whims of Apple and Google. And if Apple and Google decide that they don't like what you're doing, your entire business can get switched off just like that. You have that kind of inherent systemic risk in esports. It hasn't really crystallized, but it's a possibility. So I'll move on away from developers and publishers. And a little bit about some top clubs. So there are two websites, if you want to know who some of the top clubs are and the top players, two websites, one called Go To Gamers and one called HLTV. They both maintain details and rankings of different clubs and players using a series of metrics. And they are both reasonably well regarded. We don't know exactly the basis upon which they make all the calculations, but they're pretty well regarded. And so I thought I'd go on there and I'd have a look at, in the top three of the top esports games, who are some of the best teams, or how the ones that are most well ranked right now. And the thing that surprised me was just the amounts of presence from Korea and China. Now, if you look at this in 2 months' time or 3 months' time or 6 months' time, some of these names will have changed. Some American names and some European names, which have had a pretty slow start, will start rising up. But right now, there's an interesting split between Asians, between Europeans and Americans, rough parity. And that's about right. Of the top clubs worldwide across all the esports, very roughly, for Western esports games, there's rough parity between Europe, America, and Asia. They all have really good clubs. And the same is true broadly in relation to players as well. So these are the handles of, or the nicknames of some of the top players right now. And also it's a reminder about League of Legends and Dota and Counter-Strike being some of the top games. So that's just by way of background introduction. The stuff that I really wanted to get across, which I don't think anyone's really talked about yet, is how players and teams are actually remunerated and how the business structures between them work. And this is one of the areas where, for me, as an esports lawyer, especially for clubs and teams, this is where we're spending a lot of time. And our role is as much in trying to influence that business model as it is documenting it into a series of contracts. So the basic way in which remuneration between a club and a player works is the club pays a basic salary to the player, and bearing in mind that most of the top teams I was talking about there, most of the top games, it's normally 5+ players in the course of the team, so everything's split between them. The salaries, and I use that, I'm going to come back to whether I'm really talking about salaries, but I'll use that phrase for shorthand. The salaries are in the region of something like €2,500 on the low end a month, up to as high as €11,000 a month right now for top players. A colleague was talking to me earlier today about how they've just signed for a player, a top Dota player, a deal which is substantially higher than that, but that's on the outside. There are no players right now who are being paid $1 million plus. They don't exist. They will exist, but they don't right now. So you're looking at something in the region of maybe as much as $200,000 a year being paid in basic remuneration month by month to some of the top players. But it's not just about the basic remuneration, that's just a starting point. Where we've begun, in this current golden age of esports, there are other revenue channels beginning to be developed. So they're all up here. So tournament proceeds, this is where people mostly associate esports with. So the Dota, for example, has its international tournament, and the prize pool for that was $18 million in summer last year, and someone gets a cut of that, a big cut of that. So normally the players will get something in the region of about 10%, 10 to 20% of that. Sorry, the club gets 10 to 20%, and the rest goes to the players. So if the dream is that if the players manage to do extraordinarily well at one of the big tournaments, they're going to get millions and millions of dollars, which substantially outweighs the basic remuneration. And it's a fairly nice way of incentivizing the players, but that's one-off. That doesn't happen that often. Sponsorship is when the club makes most of its money. So for example, one of my clients, G2, which is one of the top clubs, especially in CSGO and in League, has just announced a sponsorship deal with Vodafone. It also has its peripherals sponsored by Sennheiser and by Razer and Corsair and other organizations like that. American Express has just announced a sponsorship deal. So most of the revenues from that go to the club, not to the player. And in traditional sports, players make a lot of their money from personal sponsorship deals. So you may have seen, for example, those of you who follow American sports, sports stars like, say, Kobe Bryant make very substantial amounts of money through personal sponsorship deals. Michael Jordan was one of the great archetypes of this. This doesn't really happen yet in relation to esports, but it will. Clubs have traditionally been quite controlling of the ability of their players to get personal deals. That's beginning to become more of a negotiation factor than it used to be, and you can expect that to grow substantially in the future, and probably for the clubs to take a stake as a result. And then in relation to streaming, which I'm going to talk about in a second, most of that goes to the players. Many esports clubs have become this strange hybrid of a streaming MCN and an esports club. So many of their players will spend a lot of time when they're not competing streaming on Twitch or possibly putting videos on YouTube, and that can result in quite substantial amounts of money, which on the whole the players get to keep. And that is probably going to be negotiated a little bit further in the future, but broadly speaking, that's another revenue stream for the players. And then lastly, we have stickers or virtual items. This is in particular in relation to CSGO, where virtual items such as, for example, a sticker for Fnatic, or a virtual depiction of the Fnatic logo, or a virtual depiction of, say, Cloud Gaming's logo, can raise serious amounts of money. One of my clients, off the back of one tournament, raised about $300,000 from sales of virtual depictions of its logo. And that's without even trying, and they did 12 tournaments during the course of that year. So very substantial amounts of money can be raised through basically just engaging with fans. You put all this together and the top clubs are getting into the millions of dollars in revenue. That's gross, not necessarily net. And again, that's going to grow over time. The biggest problem right now is that player salaries have eclipsed growth elsewhere. And so a number of clubs are having a funding crunch right now where in order to keep the top players, they have to grow everything else. And it's a very hard thing to do. A few words about the leagues. The first thing I'll say is that the top line, ESL, ESA, and DreamHack, are all owned by the same organization. So MTG, which is a Swedish telecoms and media and communications organization, has basically hoovered up the great majority of the top level esports leagues and organizers. And then you have a secondary tier, and you have some up and coming stars. MLG, which until recently was independent, based in New York, just acquired by Activision. You have PGL, you have Starladder, both of which are based in Eastern Europe. Turner Networks, which is one of the big television networks in the US, is a new entrant into the space. They've just done a deal under which they'll be screening a 10-part primetime TV CSGO tournament on I think Friday nights from around about the summer onwards in the US. And that's going to be a really interesting experiment as to whether Turner or television networks more generally can bring esports to the kinds of audiences who watch primetime TV who maybe don't necessarily watch esports. We'll see whether that works or not. And they're doing that in partnership with another European company called Faceit. An interesting point you'll note from this is that all of these are European with the exception of MLG and Turner. Now, whether that continues and whether you see a greater American presence in relation to leagues and organizers, we'll have to see. I think there probably will be a lot of consolidation here, and there's a big question mark hanging over the ability of leagues and organizers to remain independent in an era where the big publishers are getting involved and probably want to own their esport end to end. We'll see whether that works or not. A little bit about the broadcasters as well. So I won't say too much about this. You know all of these names. Some of these people have come to talk to you already so far. One of the reasons that I included it was just to presage one of the things I'm going to talk about later on, which is media rights. A lot of people look at a fairly superficial level at traditional sports and how much money it's made, and they say, oh, well, esports will definitely get there, or esports definitely won't, without really looking at where that money comes from. And a lot of it comes from broadcast. So, for example, in my home country, the UK, Premiership football broadcast rights over the next 3 years worldwide are worth about 10 billion sterling. So that's what, about $13–14 billion. It's a lot of money, and it's the second largest broadcast deal, is second only to the NFL in the US. What a lot of people don't realize is it's not inherently the football broadcast on its own that's valuable. What's valuable is that you can bundle football with effectively cable TV, and you can bundle it with broadband and telephone connections. And that's why the big players in Europe are willing to spend so much money to get football, because they know that if you're willing to spend $100 a month on a football subscription, you're willing to spend it on everything else as well. Now, the argument by comparison to esports, therefore, is when esports broadcast is able to be bundled together with other things, then it could become a much more interesting proposition. Now, whether that happens or not, I don't know. And right now, the way that media rights work is it's largely controlled economically by Twitch. Legally, it's kind of up in the air, which is one of the things I'm going to talk about in just a minute. And then lastly, a few words about sponsors. You've got some of the usual names on the top. Historically, esports sponsorship was largely by peripherals. Why? Because Razer and Logitech and companies like that thought that they would sell more gaming mice. They thought they would sell more gaming headsets. And that has been successful, but it led to a relatively low level of sponsorship. And a lot of clubs used it to get by, but it's not bringing in huge amounts of money. And then you have folks who are trying to do things which are a little bit more game specific. The really interesting stuff that's going to lead to serious amounts of money coming in the future is going to come from the big brands. Coca-Cola, for example, is sponsoring League of Legends. Sennheiser, I mentioned, is sponsoring one of my esports clients. There'll be more of that coming in the future. I'm given to understand that the oil majors, the US oil companies, will be making some sponsorships in esports this year. Why? Frankly, you can get similar reach to a younger demographic for a lot less money than it would cost to sponsor golf or sponsor football or things like that. So why wouldn't you give it a go? Very briefly, I'm going to talk a little about legal stuff. I'm not going to talk too much about that. So the things which I have to deal with, and the relatively few other esports lawyers there are right now in the world, on a day-to-day basis, probably about half of my time is taken up with dealing with player and team matters. And then the rest of it is with a variety of other regulatory and commercial issues, some of which are up here. A lot of the problems, and this is business as well as legal, can come from commercialization issues that esports clubs, players, leagues have got a huge amount of commercial rights which they could sell, but it's quite hard to package it up and to present it in the right way, to find the right partners. There's huge communication problems. In theory, it should be super successful, but we're not quite there yet for lots of reasons. Another problem which we're increasingly having to grapple with, which I mentioned earlier, is this question of broadcast and media rights. Who actually owns it? If I'm let's say, for example, that I'm Activision, and Activision is going to make a big play of Call of Duty in esports in the future. So let's say it's Call of Duty Black Ops 4, and there is a tournament for Black Ops 4, which is being participated in by clubs, and there are also players, of course, for those clubs. There's commentary from individual human commentators who are speaking over the video as well. How do you analyze all of that from a legal perspective? Who owns all of that stuff? To what extent can it be argued that this is all the publisher's copyright materials and therefore it's a publisher's? To what extent is it an entirely new work? All of this stuff is going to need to be worked out, and it's not a dry academic question. This is a hugely litigated matter in relation to traditional sports, because the person that can claim that they have enough possession over the broadcast rights is the person that can sell them for the largest amount of money. And huge amounts of legal effort has gone into this in relation to traditional entertainment, traditional sports. And we may well see that, I think, in esports in the future. I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about, in closing, about what I see some of the opportunities in esports are. And I could talk about this for a whole day, but some of the ones that interest me the most right now are in relation to content. Pause that thought, because that's the next slide. Player representation. One of the biggest problems I have right now is that it's really hard for players to get the representation that they need. There are not very many player lawyers, there are very few player agents, and those that there are not necessarily very au fait with esports. Players get a pretty rough deal, and this is a bad problem for a whole bunch of reasons, and it does need to be solved. I'm sure it will be in due course, but it creates a whole bunch of issues right now. Broadcast, I mentioned earlier, but in particular video on demand. Esports is relatively well served right now with live broadcast, But if you want to go back to watch something that happened, if I want to go back to one of my favorite StarCraft 2 tournaments, it's very hard to do. It's largely within the gift right now of Twitch, if they've decided to keep their VODs and they now only keep it for a relatively short period of time. YouTube, if the content's gone onto YouTube, but very often it hasn't gone onto YouTube in an authorized way, someone's just put it up there and it could be taken down at any time. There's a real opportunity for someone to create a library of top esports content. And there's a few people trying to do it, but it hasn't happened yet. And then the wider field of e-commerce marketing and sponsorship. There are huge opportunities. If you were here yesterday, you would have heard Wouter from Fnatic, one of the top European clubs, talking about Fnatic Gear, which is their intention to create a lifestyle brand around esports in the way that, for example, Nike and Adidas have become lifestyle brands as well as sports labels. That's a really interesting idea. There's huge pent-up demand for esports merchandise, good esports merchandise, and again, that's not being satisfied fully yet. The clubs do it, but it's not at the scale that it could be. And then lastly, this is where I want to sound the cautionary note of optimism, which I talked about earlier. If you're a games developer or publisher and you're thinking about creating esports content or an esports game. So all the major esports to date have been largely retrofitted for esports. So Counter-Strike, for example, was originally Counter-Strike, and before that, there've been a wide variety of iterations. Dota had its original roots as a mod for Warcraft 3. None of these games were built to be esports. They've kind of fallen into it. Now, I don't want to undo the hard work that's been done, because they work very hard to retrofit them for esports, but fundamentally that's not what they were designed for. And that's the opportunity right now. One of the things which I talked about, it's there. I wrote an article at the end of last year talking about the Supercell moment, which is a fairly trite way of looking at what Supercell did, which was to be mobile free-to-play right from the get-go. They and King and a number of companies like that, they cracked it. They didn't try to take an existing IP and make it free-to-play. They made it free-to-play right from the get-go. You've got idea. Thomas has got views, but we'll talk about that in a minute. You know, there are relatively few companies that went mobile free-to-play right from the get-go, and in the same way, there's that kind of opportunity for esports games in a way that we haven't seen so far yet. So that's great. And I'm sure there will be people here at Casual Connect Europe who will create the next generation of esports first games, but it's harder than we think it's going to be. The first point is most of the people who say they're going to do it are free-to-play games developers. And free-to-play in esports, there's a big overlap, and realistically, free-to-play mechanics are probably your primary monetization channel if you are a games developer. But free-to-play in esports are not the same thing. There's an entirely different experiential journey involved. I'll give you an example. I have a friend right now who has made a mobile free-to-play game, and all of a sudden, and they now want it to be an esports game. But in order to get the game out, they're doing the usual try and tested free-to-play route, i.e. closed beta in a relatively small country where they can get some data, and then they roll it out over time. That is death as far as esports are concerned, because you need to get the game out as soon as possible so that as many players can start playing it and the clubs can start taking an interest, because right now, the clubs are not scouting for content. You will have great difficulty going to a club and saying, my game is going to be the best game in a year's time, will you start investing in it? They will say to you, make it massive first, or let us play it right from the start so we can really get an edge, and then we'll go. And that's quite hard to make work with the way that free-to-play games are being released right now. In fact, I'd make a wider point, which is esports games are not the same as video games. Obviously, structurally and fundamentally, they are games, but they're much more than that as well. And this is, again, my point that Supercell-type thinking of envisaging the thing in itself from first principles rather than coming it to preconceptions based upon what we've done in the past. And it's going to be hard. There are those unique design issues which I talked about. So, for example, one of the problems that Psyonix had with Nosgoth, the battle arena I mentioned, which was their first kind of failure, was they didn't have a spectator mode. If there's no spectator mode right from the get-go in esports, then it literally can't be an esport. It has to have fantastic spectator technology built into it, otherwise it can't become a spectator sport. And there's going to be competition. So EA and Activision and those folks, they're not daft. They've seen a huge amount of success organically in their games without them being involved, and they'd like a piece of that. And both of them and other big publishers are making very, very smart talent acquisitions in order to gain the knowledge they don't have right now. And then the last thing I'm going to say, almost the last thing I'm going to say, is that it's absolutely crucial if you are serious about making an esport game to get people from the esports industry involved at a relatively early stage. One of my clients, for example, Dignitas, which is one of the top 10 clubs, 3 of our players formerly worked in the games industry. One was at Sega, one was at NCSoft, and one was at another game studio, I don't recall what. And they are this beautiful combination of esports talent as well as having worked in-house in the games industry. Find people like that and get as much information out of them as you can, because they will surprise you. And I know from personal knowledge that they've done consultancy work for games and said to them, I know you want to make this an esport game, but you came too late. You can't salvage this. You don't want to be those people. There's a ton more stuff I could say if you're interested in making esports games, so feel free to contact me. I pretty much run out of time, so I'm going to stop talking now, but I hope you found that was useful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jas.